has my information. Okay, got it. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and move along here into really about healthy brain, healthy workplace, cultivating a strength-based, engaged workplace culture. And I want to underline the word culture because we're going to talk about what that means in this context and why it's so important. You know, the goals are really to offer benefits, components of building a strength-based culture in the workplace, to explore what a strength-based engaged culture is, but also to talk about what it is not, because there's some myths that need to be debunked about strength-based engaged cultures. People think it's one thing when it's actually something else. And the last part of this will be to offer some practical steps for businesses, organizations, and teams to drive strengths deeper into your culture, if that's what you so desire to do. So with that, in the beginning, I want to talk a little bit about mental health and its contribution to it. So I start off with this slide, which in any of the work that we do, it really begins with this, and I remind groups of this as well as remind myself this, that all change begins with self. Healthy leadership, research after research has shown self-awareness is key to healthy leadership. So I say here, self-understanding is core to our work. And when we're talking about strengths and engagement or any other topic, the question is not just pointing my fingers at others, but say, am I implementing, am I practicing that which I'm inviting the organization, the business to begin to implement? Change always begins with me. And then from there, it goes out like ripples in a pond, and it affects those I encounter. So here's the first exercise for you to get us started into strengths. I'm going to ask you, if you have a piece of paper in front of you and a pen, write twice on that piece of paper, I use my strengths every day. But I want you to start by writing with your non-dominant hand. With your non-dominant hand, write, I use my strengths every day. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Now, I want to make sure it's very legible. And I need you to hurry up because we're under a time restraint here. So hurry up, but please write it with that non-dominant hand. I use my strengths every day. I'm assuming everybody's had time. If not, we need to hurry up now. We have business to do. We have deadlines to meet. Need to hurry. But I invite you now to change hands. Go to your dominant hand and write it twice. Now, let me just ask you the difference in that experience. You're welcome to write it in the chat. Tell me the difference between that experience of writing with your dominant and your non-dominant hand. Or you're welcome to do it. Why don't you speak it? There's no more people than there are here. Why don't you take it off of mute? And I just invite you to say what your experience was like with your non-dominant hand and with your dominant hand. Say a word about that.
Hard. It was hard to do with the left hand.
Yeah, with the non-dominant hand hard. Yeah.
Like night and day.
Like what?
Night and day.
Night and day. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Others.
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable. Okay. What else? Anything else?
Awkward, a bit slow, and took more thought.
Yeah. Slow and took more focus or more thought. Yeah. Any others? Because you see, to ask someone to work from their weaknesses is like asking someone to write with their non-dominant hand. When we write with our non-dominant hand, it takes more energy, more focus. It can create more negative emotions, especially when I'm on the other end or your supervisor's on the other end saying, hurry up now, we have deadlines, need results. It needs to be legible. It needs, when those kind of pressures are on us that are on us at work, to work out of our weaknesses, we can just recognize the frustration it creates and the frustration of engagement. The result is a kind of lack of engagement or even actively disengagement, and can lead to burnout and definitely lower retention rate in the workplace. Read somewhere that one of the studies that we did, 4 out of every 10 employees are looking for a new job. Core reasons for that is maybe a bad supervisor or boss, but even more so is they don't see the opportunity to learn, to grow, to develop. In other words, their strengths. Let me take this here. Okay, something came up for me. But to focus on your dominant hand is really, it's easier, it's natural, it takes less energy, is more engaging. And we found, it can raise retention and lower burnout because you don't have to focus as much. It's just what you naturally do. All right. So that's just an example of strengths and how important it is to work for our strengths. To give you a little bit of context here very quickly, Donald Clifton is the founder of, Clifton Strengths Assessment founder. He was in World War II, came home and went to work and was part of the Ed Psych department at the University of Nebraska and was chairman of that department, in fact. But what he was quick to recognize when he began to work with his department is they were excellent at figuring out what was wrong with people, but they weren't very good at helping people discover what was right about them. So his mantra really began to be, what would happen if we begin to focus on what's right with people rather than fixating on what's wrong with them? He began to do research there in his department. He started with the education department because that was his area, but then he broadened out beyond that to cross disciplines because he was really a business person at heart. And his question, what he began to really study with he and his teams through massive interviews was what makes for excellence, what makes for good leaders, what makes for success. And one of the things he really wanted to discover was he took to heart the statement by the guru Peter Drucker, what Peter Drucker put into words. Peter Drucker, said that most people think they know what they're good at, but they're usually wrong. But a person can only perform from their strengths. But his concern was that most people don't know what their strengths are. They don't even know them, so they don't know how to leverage them. So he thought, what would it be to develop an assessment that would allow people to identify their strengths so they know how to develop them? And that's where he really brought his work. Now, to this day, this time later, there's been approximately 22 million assessments taken, 113 different countries. 457 of the Fortune 500 companies have used Clifton Strengths in their work. So it's made and making headway. By the American Psychological Association, he was named the father of strength psychology, or actually the father of strength psychology and the grandfather of positive psychology. Okay, just give you a little background. So let me move into culture now, because we're talking a little bit about culture. And Tim, if there's a question that arises, please let me know in the chat. I think it's important to realize when we talk about strengths, we're not talking about a one and done. We found that when people take the Clifton Strengths assessment individually and try to implement it, it is very helpful, and you find their engagement goes up for a period of time. But it generally isn't sustainable for them in the workplace if the workplace culture doesn't adapt and change as a result. So I think it's important to think about organizational change and how we bring it not just for individuals, but bring it into the very culture of the organization itself. And in order to do that, I found you at least have to consider three things. The technology, yes. The process, yes. The organizational changes that have to happen. But I think another part of that has to do with the human side of change. I think to implement it in cultures, you have to keep in mind not just the organizational, but the human side, which is an area where we do a lot of work with Gilliam and Associates in the area of the human component of that. Just a few statements here about this slide about culture. My hunch is that transforming culture comes down to people and their choices to modify behavior, systems, structures, procedures, and ways of being. It must be both top down and bottom up. Strengths material, if it isn't the culture, if it isn't adopted by the executives, the leadership, it will hit a ceiling. So the key that we'll talk about a little later is inviting both bottom up and top down to meet. Another couple of comments on culture. Culture is changed, I think, through the interaction of structure and people. And I think it's fair to say no one really understands the interactions of personal agency and structure, but we know that they both matter and can enhance or construct agency. Of course, when we talk about culture again, it means what I'm saying is how do we live and how do we accomplish work around here? That's what we mean by culture. Okay, move us along. Then we move over into mental health. Why culture is so important to mental health. The culture of our workplaces can either enhance mental health and well-being, or they can destabilize it. What Gallup has found is that the development of certain strengths helps enhance mental health and well-being. It builds resilience for people and buffers against certain emotional and mental health issues, as well as well-being. When I say well-being, this is what Gallup focuses on, the 5 elements of well-being, okay? Well-being, career well-being, which is you like what you do every day. In other words, that's getting into your strengths. You do what you do best every day, and you leverage those. Social wellness is part of it. You have meaningful friendships in your life, and in your workplace. Financial well-being, you manage your money well, and you're giving guidance on that. Physical well-being, we know you have energy to get things done, as well as community well-being. You like where you live. All these are part of what we mean when we talk about well-being. And whether you're talking about Wall Street or Fast Company or Wired or across the gamut, well-being has become a major concern, as you all know, for businesses consistently, because they're concerned, because there really is the concern that our second pandemic is going to be around mental health. And that's what's beginning to emerge. And we find, and Gallup has discovered, that helping people know and work from their strengths is essential to their well-being and thriving in an organization. Okay.
So Craig, we have a question here.
Sure.
The question is, can strengths change? Can they wax and wane over time with training or lack of use, or do they remain fundamentally the same?
Great question. Thank you. Strengths, by and large, we found the reliability of them, they generally do not change much. Context does influence which strengths we're focusing on. But generally there's a total of 34 strengths themes, okay? Really the top 5, they call them signature, are just how we're wired, how we see the world. Those are just how we do life. But then really you can go down to about 15 of those top strengths. And I find those can interchange depending on our context. We change jobs, we might find a little, it's rare that you see a 34 jump up into the top 5. I have had that happen one time. It was an anomaly. What happened is, and what happened when we had the conversation is, and when I was coaching the person is, they had a major life trauma. And generally that accounts for a major shift. But most of the time, the top 10 or 5, when they do change around, it's just those top 5 or 10 changing places. Fair enough? So thanks for that question. Great question. What we found is people who focus on using their strengths are 3 times as likely to report having an excellent quality of life or are thriving. The importance of it. We've also found that people are 6 times as likely to be engaged in their jobs when they're using their strengths, when they're writing with their dominant hand, rather than being required to write with their non-dominant hand. So what that means in many cases is, it doesn't mean we don't agree on the goals people are reaching for. We do agree on goals, and we're accountable for our goals. But we have different ways of getting there and achieving those goals, okay? Engagement is big in as far as moving organizational success forward, okay? What Gallup had found when we're talking about engagement, what we mean according to Gallup is there are the engaged, which Gallup found on the world scale, according to some research they did on the world stage, about 16% of employees are engaged in the workplace. In the US Canadian scale landscape, about 34% engaged. So we're about double what the world employment economy looks like, about double, which is good, but I also think we can do better. The second level, though, has to do with those who are not engaged. Those are the people who come to work, who do their job, work from 8 to 5 or whatever the work, whatever the hours are for that person. They check off the list and they go home. Not a lot of extra things invested in it. Engaged, I'm excited, I'm committed, I'm enthusiastic about my work. Not engaged, I do what I need to do. And those people play an important role in the workplace, in performance, in reaching our results. They play an important result, but they're not engaged. So they really don't drive the organization. And then the last group of people is actively disengaged. What we found in the United States is about 50% are not engaged, and about 16% are actively disengaged. The disengaged are actually the people who can do an organization, a business harm through gossip and through multiple behaviors that are not acceptable to the culture of the organization. Okay. So what we're talking about here is simply to say 6 times as likely to be engaged. And you can see engagement leads to higher performance and better results. About 1 in 4 people, recently it slid down into 1 in 3 people say that they work from their strengths every day. Okay. Let me move to this place. Just very quickly, I want to throw this at you. Is to enhance well-being and mental health, we need to counteract negative emotional experiences. The more hours each day that Americans, employees can use their strengths to do what they do best, which studies have shown from Gallup is the less likely they are to report experiencing worry, stress, anger, sadness, or physical pain during the previous day. Now, if you go to this one, it also shows we all experience stress in our work. It's part of the job. But those thriving and engaged know their strengths and work from them, experience less stress than those who are not engaged. If you look here, thriving and engaged experience far less stress, negative stress, than those who are not engaged and not applying their strengths. Okay. It has a mental health factor to it. So with that said, here's what we mean, the difference between what we often have done, the conventional approach and the strengths-based approach to the workplace. And these mainly here, the conventional model used to be maintain each person's strengths and work on fixing weaknesses. Focus on fixing weaknesses. Now we have to be proficient in our job place. We understand that. There's a certain level of proficiency we have to have in all areas, certain areas. But what strengths-based approach says is focus on each person's strengths and manage around their weakness. In other words, you're not focusing on what's wrong with people, but what's right with them. And how do you leverage that to bring out their best, but also to move the organization forward? Strengths is about, the focus is not about putting in what was left out. If you're having to do that, the employee might be in the wrong position. The focus is how do you draw out what is in, the best that is in them. Helping those we manage bring out or maximize their best, what they bring to the workplace for better results. All right. So there's a difference between maintaining strengths and fixing weaknesses versus focus on each person's strengths and managing their weakness. Okay. This is what I like to do in an exercise. Just going to ask you mentally to do this as we move along. Part of what strengths and affects mental health, it affects our well-being and managing the negative, stressful emotions that we have and worry and anger, etc. We ask people to think oftentimes about your best day at work. You know, how would you describe that day? What did that look like for you? To think about what made it great for you. What was there about that day that made it your best day at work? And how did you feel as a result of that day? Okay. How did you feel? How would you describe that day? What made it great for you? How did you feel? And a question always is for me, and how do you get more of that? And here's the reason why I think this is important. It's really behavioral economics in a nutshell, which says there's really a strong connection between who you are and what you do best. what you do best, and how you feel. How you feel and how you perform. Who you are and what you do best. It's tapping into your strengths, core identity stuff. What you do best and how you feel. How you feel and how you perform. So what is a strengths-based culture? I think this is really getting to the heart of this work and this work. Strength-based engaged organizations integrate strengths and engagement development into their mission, their values, their vision, their processes, as well as into how people work and collaborate daily. What they came up with, Gallup came up with, is what they call the Big Six, discovered as the priorities for engagement and strength-based workplace in today's culture. The first one is we found the Big Six now and continuing into the future seems to be a focus on purpose versus paycheck. You know, used to it was the drive was the paycheck. And it's not to say paychecks are not important. Please hear that. We need to put food on the table. We need a roof over our, the basic human needs, Maslow's theory needs to be met. But it's to say a driving force is also about purpose has become very important, even in context of the pandemic. What we found is people are asking the question about meaning and purpose to what they're doing and why they're doing it. So remember back in 1983, Steve Jobs was trying to entice John Scully of PepsiCo to leave a wildly successful career to become Apple's new CEO. And it was interesting, Jobs' question to Scully was, do you want to spend the rest of your life making sugar water? Or do you want a chance to change the world? Today, that's a question about purpose that Steve Jobs was trying to tap into. It wasn't yet realized. It was almost ahead of his day. But it's about purpose, not just paycheck, which is the big ESG movement going on in cultures right now. Then a focus on development versus satisfaction. What we're finding is people aren't as concerned about frivolous perks at work, those extrinsic drives, while they are important, the intrinsic drive seems to be very significant now for people. And what they found is in one particular survey, only 4 in 10 strongly agreed that their organization focuses on development versus satisfaction. What we found is people have a tendency to leave organizations because of the boss. Yeah, but they all are their supervisors, but a leading reason for people to leave is that they don't feel they're being developed, that there's a future for them in terms of development and growth. Third, the whole notion of being a coach versus being a boss. People want managers who can coach them to understand and apply their strengths, and who value them as people, who walk alongside and not just kind of hold over. Another one of the Big Six people are finding, the Gallup has discovered here, is that people want conversations, not reviews. People want ongoing conversations and genuine discussions about how they're doing. In other words, actual genuine feedback, not a kind of one time or once, twice a year kind of reviews. And in fact, one of the things that Gallup has found fairly recent that really helps engagement, and it's around strengths, is for the manager to have at least one meaningful conversation per week with the people he or she supervises or manages. And to the level they can do that, the engagement and the performance seems to rise. Strengths versus weaknesses. People want a chance to do what they naturally do best every day. And only 3 in 10 strongly agree that they do. Obviously, when I'm doing what I do best, when I'm working for my strengths, the morale is stronger. It also serves as a barrier to some of the mental health and dysfunctions that can happen in the workplace. An example might be the whole notion of positivity from the balcony can be a barrier to low morale in the workplace, and even depression is an example. I know for athletes, they talk about the flow a lot. Flow is about they're playing, they're working out of their strengths. It's really a barrier to addictions, substance addictions, or substance abuse at least. So once again, focusing on our strengths just helps the morale, helps people perform at their best, and for the outcomes to be better. Life versus job. People want authentic relationships with management that include talks about life and work. They want to work somewhere that values them and their ongoing development. They want to know the people care about them as people while they know that results are important. Okay, I'm pushing this along. So when employees know and use their strengths, they're more engaged, nearly 6 times according to studies, and are 3 times more likely to report having an excellent quality of life or are thriving, which all this quality of life decreases the kind of negative emotions that really destabilize mental health, and results in higher engagement and performance and raises employee retention. And in other words, our employees are a lot less likely to leave the company. Taking the Clifton Strengths assessment is not enough, but it is the beginning place. 1 in 4 reports working from their strengths every day. To drive it deeper is key so that it changes the conversation, motivation, morale, engagement, performance. And that it can transform a culture and improve health and well-being in an organization and people. So here's some things. So we've talked a little bit there about what strengths are not. Let me talk about what they are. So a strengths-based engaged culture is not. I think these are some debunking. It's not just taking an assessment, one and done, and the organization is changed forever, nor the individual. It's something that takes, that's why when we give the Clifton assessments, oftentimes we provide coaching to help them drive it deeper, as far as an individual, how do they leverage it, but also when it comes to the larger organization. Sometimes the second one is not a place that ignores weaknesses. It and Harvard Harvard Business Review went back and forth because Harvard accused Gallup of ignoring weaknesses. And they kept saying, we're not ignoring weaknesses. We need to know our weaknesses. But there's a difference between knowing our weaknesses and managing them versus fixating on them. So instead, it recognizes the greater gains to be had from focusing on strengths and managing weaknesses. Focusing on weaknesses, you'll never get above average. To get to excellence, you build on strengths. The third thing is, it's not an excuse for employees to avoid certain tasks or performance expectations, nor does it excuse certain behaviors. I've seen people before who say, I can't do that because it's not a strength. It's not my strength. Well, in the workplace, as we all know, that's a performance issue. That's not a strengths issue. And have to be addressed accordingly. The next one is does not de-emphasize accountability. Strengths does not de-emphasize accountability. Both engagement and strengths are to help achieve goals for which one agrees to be accountable. I find if it's working from people's strengths and they're able to utilize those to achieve agreed on goals that they're aware of and have the resources to reach, I find they like being held accountable for it more. The last one here is does not replace your existing culture. Strengths doesn't replace your culture. It helps you harness and amplify the best part of who you are as a culture, your culture. You know, that's that drawing out for the organization rather than trying to put in. All right. Got just a few more slides here. These are the pillars. I started off using the word steps, but I use pillars because it's more of a web and a system. It's not a linear checklist. I mean, and we all know that from our work in our organizations. It's a system, and all these multiple parts are interacting at any given moment that you have to take into account. Every organization is different. Some make changes quickly, others take more time. Some use a formal top-down approach, while others approach change more organically. It is a nonlinear, multi-layer process. But the first pillar I name here is start wherever it enters the system. Whether it starts below, above, or in between, wherever it starts, that's the place you begin. Wherever the ball is dropped on the golf course, that's where you hit it from, okay? But to take root in the culture, it must get buy-in from the CEO or the executive sponsors. Ultimately, it's got to get buy-in there if it's really going to permeate the culture of the organization, okay? Pillar 2, give every employee the opportunity to discover their strengths through the Clifton Strengths Assessment. And give them the opportunity to design their work accordingly when possible, while still holding them accountable to reach their goals. So therein is an ongoing conversation between the manager and the team, the people they supervise. Pillar 3, provide the opportunity for training and support for managers, and if possible, employees. Create strengths champions in your system. You know, the next is to build an internal network of strengths coaches to help your managers. Help coach them what that looks like and give them context. You know, it infects the way we give feedback to the people we manage. The fifth is to integrate strengths with performance management. You know, what we say oftentimes is your talent times your investment, which means education, study, learning, growing, equals strengths. That 10,000 hours question. And the pillar 6 is, as you're moving into, if you move into a strengths culture for yourself, but also for the whole culture of the organization, for the workplace, transform your internal program. You need to, I would suggest tracking results, because every culture is different. So you have to track it so you can recalibrate when needed. In other words, you're learning as you go in part. Is that fair? And here's my last few slides here. So after all this, how do you know its strengths has become part of the culture? I'm quoting someone outside of the arena of strengths, but I think it's an important one Edgar Sheen, as many of you might know, kind of the guru in culture. No, he was at MIT. He writes, if it is successful and people like it and it becomes a norm, then you can say it has become a cultural change. That's a pretty interesting quote. How do you know it? Strengths and engagement has become part of the culture, or anything for that matter. If it's successful, if people like it, and if it becomes a norm, then you say it has become a cultural change. And the other question is, as you work with culture, engagement, and strengths, a friendly reminder. You know, sometimes people think of strengths and some of this work as kind of warm and fuzzy. The purpose of a company and a focus on strengths and engagement is not to create a nice culture, but to function in the economy, to provide goods and services. There's no more effective way to empower people than to see each person in terms of his or her strengths while managing around their weakness. And then there's the end. So questions, comments, what was helpful to you? I would like to hear from everybody who would. One thing that you heard in here that resonated for you, that might have been helpful, or that you might be saying waiting for their light. And you can do that by going off of mute if you would, but I would like to hear that, and then we'll just have a conversation for the time left.
Let's-
This is Gilliam with Volunteers for Youth Justice. Our organization has been using the strength-based program for about 3 years now.
Hmm.
And it's been working really well for it. Our executive director puts people in positions and changes them around to meet their strengths and to sort of get them out of where they might have weaknesses. And we have our staff meeting each month, and we go we have a company come in that goes into depth about this. And everybody gets excited about it, and it's just really worked well for us.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's neat. If you were to say the one most important in bringing that into your organization, what was most important in helping that to happen? The whole strengths approach. What have you learned?
Well, it's sort of been interesting that, I won't say 100% of our employees have loved it, but I will say 98% of them have. And to have the whole group buy into something, instead of people, saying, oh, it's a staff meeting each month, everybody's more like excited about it. And they're, anxious to learn a little bit more about our meeting. So we'll have, an hour and a half or so will be around strengths and weaknesses and everything. And then we'll have a little short staff meeting. So it's more brought the organization together. And we have a lot of people have like their top 5 on their office areas. And so it just sort of gets everybody to know each other a little bit better.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. One thing you bring to this, just invite anybody to say that one thing one takeaway for you that was helpful. You're still waiting for the light, maybe, whatever that question might be. What is one thing?
I think your question about what was kind of one of your best days like, can you get back into that? And so I thought about, I work with a nonprofit and with faith-based leadership. And I think one of my best days is when I have real engagement from one of these volunteer religious leaders and can move along kind of the purpose, our aim to kind of work together more and to share together. When that happens, I feel like I've done my job, and I feel productive. And I feel like that I've connectivity is one of my strengths. And I just realized that's that. And of course, in meetings, I'm thinking about engagement. People who are not engaged, man, it's just a dreary thing. And you think about all the Zoom calls you're on, and people trying to say, well, how can I engage that person in a way that they're motivated to do something? And so that's kind of what my thinking is about today. And thank you.
Thank you. Others, any others?
Again, I have to echo what Dan was saying about sort of your best day ever. I mean, that's to me a really helpful way to frame the strengths sort of output, because it's not just about in some cases, for me, it's not just the thing I like to do. It's the context or the opportunities that it creates to hit on all cylinders. And some of those experiences occur over the course of a day, and so you may find that there are elements of your strengths, background that manifest themselves in different ways with different things. And if you can have a day where you're hitting on more than one, or they come together in a particular activity that builds on multiple strengths at the same time, I think that's what you're searching for.
Nice. Nice.
Craig, I have a question for you. You mentioned that sometimes when you work with companies or individuals, you also offer coaching. What does that look like? How does that work? What sort of things do you do or do you work with?
Well, so a lot of times what it means is helping them to understand and unpack the layers of those strengths. It's one thing to know a strengths theme, a word, I'm an achiever. But then to begin to understand a couple of things, what that means in various contexts, as well as what they call theme dynamics. None of these themes work alone. They're always working, interacting with others. And so it's helping them, and at times is backing off and reminding that person, they're saying, oh, I've got an issue here I'm dealing with at work or in life. And my question might be, well, let's talk about which strengths would be most helpful. Which one of your strengths would be most helpful to you in addressing that? Or which 2 or 3 strengths might be most helpful to you in addressing that? And then we start talking about so it's really calling them back to that place of what are your strengths? So knowing what your strengths are and which ones might be most helpful in this context. How do you leverage that? What might that look like? And so it really brings them back to that place. In some ways, it brings them back to themselves.
Interesting. Thank you.
And another part of that, real quick, Carol, just to comment, is it's also can be interesting, and I know y'all have done some work there, is understanding the strengths of your partner and your team in the workplace. There's nothing more powerful, as you know, than sitting around a table and the supervisor or the boss is sitting there and knows your strengths, theirs, and them looking over across the table and saying, this is not my strength, this is yours.
Right.
Would you take this ball and run with it? Wow, what does that do to a team?
Right.
See, they're valued for who they are. Three things Donald Clifton knew that I think were so profound and simple. He knew every individual is unique. Every individual has a strength. And every individual is more fulfilled when they're working from those strengths. And so I think those are important premises that he worked from, assumptions that he worked from regularly, that I think have proven to be true with empirical evidence and research. So, thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Any other questions or comments about what stood out to you from this today? What thought stood out for you or was most helpful?
I think we're just about at the top of the hour, so we can go ahead and just thank you again. If you do have questions again, I have Craig's contact information. If we can, it's right up there on the screen as well. But if you don't get a screenshot or write it down, we can certainly go ahead and put you in touch with him. And Craig, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us, and thank all of you for joining us. Really. All right, everybody, have a great weekend.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So Tim, is everyone off?
Yep. Okay, just us.
Okay. Well, how did it go? Did it work?
I thought it